professor here at McMaster University. In 2013, through Crohn's and Colitis Canada, Dr. Reinisch became the inaugural holder of the Audrey Campbell Chair in Ulcerative Colitis Research. Dr. Reinisch graduated from the Medical University in Vienna, where he finished his training in internal medicine and gastroenterology. He is a founding member of the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization and was active in the Scientific and Public Affairs Committee of the United European Gastroenterology. Dr. Reinisch is an expert in designing, conducting, and interpreting the results of clinical trials in inflammatory bowel disease, and we are delighted to have him join us this evening to talk about improving the care of Crohn's and colitis. So Dr. Reinisch.
It's something new to me. It's not new to run educational events with patients. This is what I used to do back in Vienna, Austria as well, but it's new to me that this is broadcasted via web and that the patients have also the opportunity to watch us via this medium. I thought it might make sense to start this event actually with the basis of all our knowledge we are applying to our patients with inflammatory bowel disease, and this is research. Without any research, without any clinical research, it would not be possible to address or to address any of your issues in the best manner. And therefore, I thought that it might worthwhile to start this series tonight with some issues on or some aspects of clinical research. The question is, why is research particularly important for Canada? And you may know Canada is a hotspot or the hotspot when it comes to the incidence and prevalence of inflammatory bowel diseases. You can see it here from the publication back in 2012 from a group in Calgary. So again, Canadian research had brought this alive, where it was shown that Canada is a red spot here in the prevalence of patients with inflammatory bowel diseases. And I think, therefore, it is also important for us to continue this work and to take the advantage of Canada to produce further important data to improve the care of our patients here. Different kind of research topics which could be of interest for you. First of all, we can, of course, facilitate and assist in the process to bring new drugs on the market. I will discuss this later on. We have already quite a good armamentarium of compounds for our patients with inflammatory bowel disease, but we need more. Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are very heterogeneous disease, and we need more options to address this heterogeneity of the diseases we see in our patients. Secondly, we do have these compounds, some compounds are already available on the market, but we also need to study how can we optimize the use of these drugs. Can we combine drugs to get a better outcome? How can we monitor for levels of drugs in the systemic to see as to whether we can improve further the performance of the existing drugs. Thirdly, and this is something which is, in my opinion, heavily underrated, is the importance on how we can challenge our new diagnostic standards and how can we improve our monitoring tools to monitor the inflammatory burden of our patients with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And I will share some thoughts on this as well. And clinical research helped us a lot more recently to drive further our goals, which we would like to achieve in our patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And finally, and the hardest goal to achieve, but hopefully we will succeed in some time, is to decipher finally the cause of inflammatory bowel diseases. So we will find the reason why some patients do acquire the disease, whereas healthy individuals do not. But back to the developmental path for drugs before they get a market authorization. You can see here it's quite a long journey before a compound which is here considered as a potential compound or a potential active substance for a patient with inflammatory bowel disease until market authorization. So a lot of preclinical research needs to be done, including also pharmacological, toxicological studies and authorization process before actually our level of knowledge increases when bringing these drugs into clinical trials. And these clinical trials are subdivided in phases, and I will spend some moments on those phases later on. But you can here easily see that from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 3, our knowledge of the performance of the drugs increases dramatically, associated with an increased cost of these studies up to millions and billions of dollars. And finally, it takes this journey takes between 8 to 10 years before finally one of those active substances which were considered as a potential target make it on the market, or finally could be even rejected. So those studies which are of interest for you and which are of interest for our patients with inflammatory bowel diseases are the studies in the clinical phases 2 and 3. There are also these study phases 0 and 1, but actually these study phases addressing much more healthy volunteers. More recently, we have also seen some phase 1 studies in patients with inflammatory bowel diseases, but these studies serve much more the purpose to investigate the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, meaning to study the performance of the drug within the body and to see how the first tolerance results look like. Much more important are the studies of phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2 is somehow an intermediate stage where 50 to 200 subjects are included. These studies take about some months and are subdivided in proof of concept studies. Phase 2B, where you would like to see some biologic activity and first efficacy of the drug, whereas phase 2B studies are so-called dose-finding studies, where we would like to have a good guess which might be the best dose finally, which could give the best results in later phases. And the studies which are of particular importance are the phase 3 studies, which usually include hundreds and sometimes up to thousands or even more of patients. And more recently, we have seen huge studies in patients with inflammatory bowel disease as well, including up to 1,000 patients. So this takes months and years. And nowadays, actually, the recruitment takes more and more time as the armamentarium of labeled drugs is increasing. But finally, these studies serve the purpose to assess the efficacy and the safety of these compounds for regulatory submission. And finally, then there are these phase 4 studies after approval of a given indication, and they serve the purpose for the assessment of rare adverse events. But the principle of all these clinical trials is finally safety. So safety always comes first, and there is a regulatory network in place which should guarantee that each study which is offered to a patient with inflammatory bowel disease has all the safety nets in place which we can consider. So first of all, Health Canada is the federal regulator here responsible for authorizing the importation of drugs for the purpose of clinical trials. They review all clinical trial applications for the phases 1, 2, and 3, and they somehow ascertain that subjects participating in the trial will not be exposed to an undue risk. So Health Canada also provides a clinical trial database which should help patients to pinpoint maybe studies which could be of interest for them. And also the government in the United States is providing huge clinical trial database on which you could find as to whether there are trials ongoing on a certain substance in your region or not. But there is even more in Health Canada, which has a strong stance in the assessment of clinical trials. There is the International Code of Harmonization, a good clinical practice code, which is important to be considered and to be in place when clinical trials are ongoing. So this good clinical practice defines the role of institutional review boards, of independent ethics committees, which are reviewing every single study for its eligibility for patients. They also define the responsibilities of investigators as to whether a certain investigator is qualified, as to whether a hospital is qualified, as to whether there are enough resources available to run the study, as to whether the compliance with the protocol is kept. They also define the sponsor responsibilities about manufacturing the drug, supplying the drug, safety issues, and there are audits in place by Health Canada or FDA for certain sites, which are including particularly for including patients in high numbers. So why then do we think that clinical trials in patients with inflammatory bowel disease are so important? First of all, I mentioned already we need to get new drugs for patients with inflammatory bowel disease on the market, and so that we can prescribe those drugs. We have already a good armamentarium available, but the treatment options are limited, and we do know there is this heterogeneity in Crohn's and the heterogeneity in ulcerative colitis, and not every single drug works in each patient or in every individual in the same manner and the same well. We should also consider that we could take advantage of clinical trials as a potential alternative or additional therapeutic opportunity before we are prescribing the so-called last resort drug in our patients with IBD. And something that I learned particularly also, which seems to be important here in Canada, is that no direct costs are attached to these trials as compared to labeled treatments. And finally, you can expect excellent care when participating in a clinical trial. There are no waiting lists. There is a team of study coordinators, a team of study nurses and experienced investigators who accompany our patients. So I'm often asked when I'm addressing a patient with inflammatory bowel disease with a clinical trial as to whether there is a placebo control in place or not. And yes, so most of the trials which are ongoing do have a placebo control, and this is a very good reason. So this is the result from a trial which we published some years ago, and you can see here a very nice response dose-response relationship between the active drug and those with increasing doses. There was a higher number of clinical responses observed. So with the 1.0 milligram per body weight group, the response rate was 18%, and with the 1 milligram per kilogram body weight group, it was 40%, and with the 4 milligram per kilogram body weight, it was 58%. So actually, this looks really good, and this would mean the more drug you're exposing to the patient, the better is the efficacy. But look at the rate of the placebo response. It was 60%. So finally, this drug didn't make it on the market, and you barely can believe. So why is someone with inflammatory bowel disease, and actually there's a study on Crohn's disease, why are 60% of the patients responding after a single infusion after 4 weeks of treatment? So that's still a miracle, but it occurs, and this is happening, and this is a reality. And therefore, it's so important that we have drugs in the end which are much better than placebo. Otherwise, we could simply apply placebo to our patients. And you may wonder, okay, this is clinical response. This is only related to symptoms. But nowadays we have even more stringent endpoint. And this is data from another study where we had an interest on mucosal healing or the improvement of the mucosa, so the mucosal appearance, how much inflammation is there. And you can see the active drug luckily induced an improvement of the mucosa in about 45%, but placebo still induced an improvement in about 30%. So there is an important effect of placebo which we need to understand and which also we need to have as a control when running clinical trials in our patients with inflammatory bowel disease. This is the therapeutic pyramid, and I don't like to delve into deep on this because John Marshall will cover the therapeutic pyramid of our IBD patient, but it should simply show you that regulatory bodies subdivide, so to speak, the patient population of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease patients in 3 different categories. As to whether this is correct or not, it's on a different page, but it's somehow a simplification on how we can recruit patients for clinical trials. And there are patients with mild disease, there are patients with moderate disease, and there are patients with severe disease. And therefore, also our trials, so to speak, try to define the patient's population according to this criteria. This is a very busy slide, but it should give you an idea how complex most likely the pathogenesis of inflammatory bowel diseases are. So the idea is that based on a genetic background or a genetic predisposition, there is an increased inflammatory response of the mucosal immune system in the gut towards the own microbial flora in the gut. And from the release of all these inflammatory mediators, which are listed here, new inflammatory cells are finally recruited further into the mucosa and perpetuating this inflammatory process. So our drugs nowadays try to target those inflammatory mediators or try to target those molecules which are responsible for the migration of these inflammatory cells into the tissue in order to further perpetuate the disease. And you can see here a long list of mediators which might be of interest. One of the mediators which is currently addressed already by 3 drugs quite successfully is TNF-alpha, and we have infliximab, adalimumab, and golimumab available, which addresses TNF-alpha. But there's many more studies currently ongoing, also addressing a bunch of other of these inflammatory mediators, and I will highlight this in a couple of minutes. And so what kind of drugs do we have available? Can we apply for our patients with inflammatory bowel disease? And very roughly, there is a subdivision of 2 kinds of medications nowadays. There are the biologics. These are these very large molecules which are manufactured from biologic sources, are very specific to target one of these mediators or one of those molecules which are on the surface of the inflammatory cells. And there are these very small molecules which look like an aspirin from the chemical structure, and they are of low molecular weight. They usually penetrate into the cell and have regulatory impact or impact on the regulatory network of the cells. So by and large, we have to differentiate, therefore, between these biologics and the small molecules. But it's also another achievement of clinical trials, or has been an achievement of clinical trials, is our better understanding of the therapeutic goals. So for the longest time, we were convinced that we have to address, of course, the symptoms of the patient. So how many bowel movements do you have? How many bloody stools do you have? how much pain do you have, how is your quality of life. This is extremely important. But actually, this is only the tip of the iceberg, because we do know for Crohn's disease, and we do know meanwhile from ulcerative colitis, that the clinical symptoms not necessarily always reflect the inflammatory burden which is underneath. And therefore, and this is what we also learned from clinical trials, we have to address, we try to translate this currently in our clinical practice as well. We have to address biomarkers of inflammation and have to monitor biomarkers of inflammation, like C-reactive protein, or we can offer more recently here in our hospital a test which also measures inflammation in the stool, and hopefully on the long term we might be possible to obviate repetitive colonoscopies by measuring simple fecal calprotectin. We also, as I said, we also like to achieve the healing of the mucosa. So we don't like to see patients any longer ongoing who feel well, but finally still have these ulcerations and erosions in the mucosa. All this needs to be healed, and even if some scarring tissue is left, there should be no inflammation left, and all the ulcers should be healed. And nowadays we even strive further and try to get even rid of all these inflammatory cells which might be left in the mucosa, are only seen under the microscope. So what we have currently a rich pipeline, so to speak, of clinical trials here available, and very briefly I only would like to highlight two of them, and this is maybe a learning from this educational series. One of those trials is a phase 2, so you have learned it's an intermediate phase trial, multicentric, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. Now you know why we have placebo in place, and actually this is a compound for patients with Crohn's disease, which address one of those inflammatory mediators which we can measure in very high amounts in the mucosa of our patients with Crohn's disease. And I'd like to briefly highlight another study as well. This is now a study phase 3 program, so hopefully if this molecule shows further positive results, it might make it on the market for ulcerative colitis. So it's a study for ulcerative colitis patients with a small molecule, phase 3, placebo control, and we do have already some data on this trial available from a phase 2 program, and you can see here again a very nice dose response or dose remission relationship. So the higher the dose was in the study, the higher was the rate of clinical remission. Up to 50% of patients achieved a clinical remission with this compound. But look at the placebo rate here. It's not 50%, it's 10%. So there's a clear difference of 38% plus for patients being exposed. And you can even look at the more stringent endpoint, which is endoscopic healing, achieved in 30% of patients with the 10 milligram dose as compared to 2% with placebo. So again, a difference of 28%. So the molecule is already on the market for rheumatoid arthritis in US, not yet in Canada. So let's see how this clinical results may look like, but there are still some slots available for this study as well. Maybe I can skip this one. There is a success story I also like to mention from McMaster University, and I'm not allowed to show all the details because the data is currently submitted to a very good journal in internal medicine. So it has been shown that the microbial flora in patients with ulcerative colitis is very much reduced in its abundance and its richness, and when it's sometimes compared that the bacteria a patient has with ulcerative colitis in his gut is comparable with the flora of a desert as compared with the flora of a vivid forest. And under the helm of Paul Moyetti, more recently, a study was finished with fecal microbiota transplantation. So a fecal transplantation, so the transplantation of healthy bacteria or of bacteria from healthy individuals to patients with ulcerative colitis. And once again, I'm not allowed to say more, but it's a story of success, and you will hear more about the results of the study in short. But this also shows you that investigators can start clinical trials on their own, even without support of industry. So finally, I'd like to highlight a project which is steered from the Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto under the lead of Ken Crowder. And I think it's a very important project, and I think it's very important to make as much as PR as possible about this project, because this project has the aim to find out what are the reasons why patients with Crohn's disease do become patients with Crohn's disease in the end. It's the CHAM project, and in this project, the investigators recruit 5,000 siblings and offspring of Crohn's disease patients in order to find 75 subjects who develop during the course of observation finally Crohn's disease. And then from the baseline data, so from the blood samples which are collected, on which DNA investigations are performed, from the stool samples which are collected, from which microbiome studies will be performed, the investigators try to find out what is the difference of those patients who develop Crohn's disease as compared to those patients who remain healthy. And hopefully this study might help to identify the triggers of Crohn's disease. So I'd like to summarize my presentation as follows. I think clinical research is highly important and essential for our better understanding of IBD in many aspects, in bringing new drugs on the market, to improving the care with the existing drug, to push our diagnostic standards, and actually for some patients they might also offer additional therapeutic opportunities before you are consuming the so-called last resort drug for your disease. Many thanks. Thank you.